You can start.
Okay, fair enough. Right. This is the social history of Ireland from Antiquity to 1700 AD. We're sort of starting round about 1500 and taking it from there. To be precise, around about 1530. And I've called this Conquest and Colonialism. I'm afraid there's quite a lot of violence in this episode because it was a very violent time between 1500 and 1700, and a lot of different struggles going on, which we will be talking about tonight. So this picture behind the writing there, that's the walls of Derry, which has become a very potent symbol in modern Irish or Northern Irish history. It was the walls here as shown. This was a planter town set up by merchants from London in the 17th century, and it had these walls. It's still got these walls to today, and up until very recently, the centre of Derry was considered to be out of bounds for Catholic Irish people, and so I think this is actually quite a good image to start off with, or Derry stroke London Derry. The English, because it was originally called Derry, Derry meaning oakwood, or Dira in the original Irish, but it became it got given this name Londonderry by the colonists. So which the unionist side of the argument in Northern Ireland still maintains it as. Okay, we can move on to the first picture. Basically, what we're going to be talking about here now is, now this is a medieval painting of some peasants at their labor in the fields. I'm going to start with talking about the changes that were going on in the societies of Europe at the time. So medieval peasants, despite they had obviously great curtailments on their freedoms, particularly on their freedom of movement, but they also had considerable control of the labor that was due to the lord. Now basically the surplus which the peasants were producing, that would go to the lord or to the church, and there were many different rules which the lord or the church couldn't cross. So they couldn't. There were lots of holy days, for example. Holy days were when no work was done at all. So, and there were many saints, and the more saints you had in your pantheon, the better, because that would mean that you would have less work you would have to do for somebody who's basically living off you, which is the Lord or the church. And they also had certain rights. A lot of this is overlooked in modern ideas of what the Middle Ages were like, and that the peasants were basically, they could be, the Lord could do what they wanted. Up to a certain extent, that was true. The Lord had weaponry, they didn't, by and large, the peasants. So they had the power of force behind them, but in terms of the I mean, you can't just rule by coercion. You've got to rule by consent. So in particular the holy days, but there were many other methods in which the peasants were able to control the amount of surplus that they had to produce. This all starts to change, however, in one country in Europe, and it's unprecedented in world history. It's been well examined by a historian known as Ellen Meiksins Wood, is her full name, and she identifies the exact moment in, or I mean, when I say exact, it's not exact. It takes place over 200 years, but it's a transitional process to a new type of society, and it starts off in the countryside, not in the towns as we think. We normally get the idea that capitalism, for example, I mean, that arose in the towns. Well, problem is, or through markets. The problem is that markets and towns have existed since year dot, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there is capitalism there. Basically, it means that because the markets are generally well controlled. There's a universal understanding in most pre-capitalist societies. There's a universal understanding that the market, left to its own devices, will create chaos, and so therefore it has to be regulated. That all changes under what happens in England. Now, England has a relatively, compared to say France and Spain, places like this here, they have quite a substantial nobility. Maybe talking about 5% of the population. In England, it's more like 1 or 2%, and they own, by and large, a lot of them are quite big landlords, so they can't use the same means of extortion, if you like, of the peasantry. You know, they don't know them. You know, they're just names on a book that they have. So you can't extract the surplus of them through your own personal ties to the people. See, this is one of the big things which had almost every society which had occurred before then. They really depended on personal ties in order to extract surplus. But it changes in England, and as I say, England was also a very centralized state. It's centralized to a much higher degree before any other of the medieval European states. And it continues to be so, especially after they've had a civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. Then everything starts to change, and it's because the lords are looking for ways to extract more capital out of the peasantry, which they always are. You know, I mean, that's part of the class struggle, if you like, throughout history, is that always nobles and the peasants are like this because they have different interests. But in England, the lords, in the process of what I'm going to be talking about tonight, they become extremely powerful, and they also start to promote a new ideology, and it's a new ideology of the market and promoting the market. And eventually they have their own propagandists appearing, like John Locke, people like that. they start to appear around about the 17th century. Prior to that, it's more a process of what actually happens in the towns. Basically, or not in the towns, in the countryside, where they are trying to make as much money as possible, or as much wealth as possible out of the peasantry, and they don't have the traditional means that, say, a landlord in France might have, because he knows his subjects, and he can go around and he can extract it, either by threats or by force if necessary, but or by just the fact that he knows them, he can make them feel guilty or whatever. In England, you don't have that, because the personal ties are no longer there. So therefore, the wealth has to be extracted by different means, and it's through the means of the market that and it becomes a economic cudgel, is the word I've used here. It was used for raising rent or labor due, because what they said to the peasants was, which had never been said before, because you weren't allowed to evict your peasants, was if you don't make more capital for me, according to the market, like, so if it's sheep, for wool, because there's a wool industry in Flanders, for instance, and this became a good excuse for the landlords to use, and it also extracted more labor from them, because they didn't want their rents to go up, obviously, and they most certainly did not want to get evicted. But this is what you see happening on a massive scale during the 16th and 17th centuries. This mass eviction of peasants, and this change is reflected in how they deal with Ireland as well, which I'll be talking about as well. But it's there's basically a small local change in social relations, but it was to have enormous consequences beyond that. So we can move to the next picture. Right, so this is the absolutist state. Now, the absolutist states emerged in the late feudal period, or late medieval Europe, whatever you want to call it. And they, as I say, the most centralized of them all was England at this point. England already had a very, very good road system, so it was easy for the king's armies to move around, so on and so forth. In France, which is what you see in this picture, there's a very powerful absolutist monarchy arose there too, but the aristocracy, they gave up their personal means of control to the king, but the king in his turn made sure that they had jobs in his tax offices, in his army, in his navy, what have you. So this is how it starts to work, and the idea of the monarch being having divine right of rule, but as I say, in France is actually still very diffuse. Under the surface, it's still very diffuse. On top, it looks like the ultimate absolutist monarchy, but underneath, it's not like that. It's all it's all diffuse. There's local laws and no markets that can be no central markets to it. Whereas in England, it's gone in a completely different direction. You can also see in this picture, you can also see the start of, this is probably the start of racialized imagery in terms of these are presumably notables from North Africa who have come to pay homage to Louis XIV. But it also works in, there's another image which I wanted to get hold of for this, but I couldn't, which shows the Doge of Genoa going through the same process of like bowing and scraping down and kissing the king's feet and what have you. Okay, so we can probably move on to the next picture now. Yeah. So these are the absolutist monarchies that arise across Europe. This is an overall map from round about. No, back one. Back one. That one, yeah. Yeah. So this is this shows the absolute monarchies which are arising, mainly England. There's France. Spain is becoming a very powerful absolutist monarchy. It's also first place to actually start to form colonies. Now, colonies in Spain, colonies, English colonies, are very different things, which we will talk about shortly. Portugal as well has centralized, and it is expanding, but expanding across into the so-called New World. You've also got another big kingdom of Austria and Hungary, which are combining into one, and that is very central. It's very landlocked. There's a kingdom of Poland as well. The Grand Principality of Muscovy will eventually become another absolutist monarchy, but it hasn't reached there yet. And one of the most powerful ones at the start of the 16th century is, in fact, Ottoman Turkey, which is in the Balkans. It's now starting to expand over Egypt and into North Africa, and also eastwards, where it clashes with the Shahs of Iran. And in the middle, you can see this huge conglomerate of petty feudal states. This was known as the Holy Roman Empire, which is, some people have pointed out, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but it basically dominates Germany and Italy. And then in Ireland, as you can see, there's this tiny little yellow bit, which is the Pale, or what's left of the Pale, and then there are various other Irish principalities around it. Scotland too is independent at this point of England, though it is weaker, considerably weaker than England. Okay, we can move on to the next picture. Yeah, so this is a quite nice little map. This is a 16th century map, and it shows Ireland. As you can see, there's not that many forests shown. I think a lot of the trees in Ireland were not, except in the north, around, especially around Lake Fermanagh and Lough Neagh. The forests have dwindled over much of Ireland. There is, of course, some confusion in the term forest, because sometimes the term forest is used in medieval texts not to talk about real forest at all, but just wasteland. It would certainly fit that a lot of the tree cover of Ireland has already disappeared by this point. Ireland here is shown. You think, well, it's not Ireland. That's another place, but it is actually Ireland. It's Ireland on its back, which is probably where the English kings wanted it to be. But it's obviously is the north. It's on an east-west axis, up down rather than so north-south. So you can see a bit of Scotland over there in the corner. All right, we can have the next picture. Yeah, so we can now talk briefly about the polities of Ireland. Now, Ireland had developed from kingdoms into what became known in later times as chiefdoms. Now, whether they were originally any different is debatable, but the Irish had a different system of succession in titles. There was a limited vote where the notables of the realm could elect the successor of the king or the chief when he died. And as you can see, these were now forming into quite big polities, a lot of them, but there were still a lot of small ones as well. And I mean, we'll be talking about the O'Malleys, for instance. They were a small polity, but because of a certain individual who I'll be talking about, they actually became quite well, they're relatively well known. The Pale was where English law still reigned in Ireland, or supposedly English law. I mean, the thing is that nobody really has any idea of to what degree it even worked within the Pale, because we know that there were people speaking Irish. They weren't allowed to speak Irish, but there were people speaking Irish within the Pale itself, and within Dublin city itself as well. And so the green areas show where the native or Gaelic Irish lords held control, and the blue areas, I'm going to be talking about this term, the Old English, right? Now the Old English means the people who came over with Henry II or shortly afterwards, and they settled down in the earlier feudal period and became lords in Ireland. And once they had settled down in Ireland and they'd lost contact with England at that time because of these disasters that I was talking about, they basically started to make local alliances. So the earldom of Ormond, for example, might go into alliance with, say, the Dempseys, and the Dempseys would then they would maybe marry off a daughter of the Dempseys into the earldom of Ormond, or vice versa. So there was quite a lot of this going on. Plus, a lot of them became bilingual. So outside the Pale, a lot of the English speakers would have been bilingual. They've been bilingual in both English and Irish. Now they would have still recognized for the most part, they would still recognize the King of England as their ultimate overlord, but they have very local territorial interests, and they've also probably adopted the Irish system of traveling poets and musicians, who can entertain them at court and give them praises and so on and so forth. So there is quite a bit of fusion going on here. The man on the right there, now he's known as Silken Thomas, and he basically can be credited with kicking this whole process off, although he doesn't do it intentionally. But the changes that are about to happen are because the English think that they rule Ireland through the Lord Protector of Ireland, who is by the 16th century is pretty much a hereditary title for the Fitzgerald family of Kildare. You can see the earldom of Kildare there. So he was basically the Earl of Kildare. He became the Lord Protector of Ireland, and he got the idea that his brother and another prominent sort of Anglo-Irish or Old English lord were being held in the Tower of London by Henry VIII, who's the king at the time, and that doesn't seem to have been the case. But he was obviously very paranoid about what they were going to do next, and so he started an uprising. The uprising was a complete disaster. He managed to alienate everybody who could have been possibly on his side, including the church, by a series of blunders, and he was eventually captured and taken to England and had his head chopped off, I think. So we can have a look at the next picture. Yeah, this basically shows he made an attack on Dublin Castle. Now that was unprecedented, despite the gains the Irish had made back on their own country in the 14th, 15th centuries. Nobody had actually attacked Dublin Castle except for this guy Silken Thomas. Now, of course, his army would have been a mixture of English type soldiery, like the knights pictured on the right there, and the musketeers and so on and so forth. But they would also have Irish units there as well. But this is the first time Dublin Castle had actually been attacked. So it was quite a worrying blow for King Henry VIII. And King Henry VIII was also very worried because previously in 1487, I think is right, that the Fitzgeralds had been again, they had sent over a Yorkist pretender army, which had rallied in Ireland, and it contained some Irish troops and also some Burgundian troops, and they had a go at restarting the Wars of the Roses in the late 15th century. They failed, of course, but it was a big worry for the kings of England that despite their lordship of Ireland, and the fact that they had subjects there, these subjects were not actually very loyal to them. So that's what happens. That's Dublin Castle, the attack on Dublin Castle. Okay, we can move on to the next picture. Right, this is a famous duo here who are facing away from each other, as they probably should be, because they were the first. It was the man on the right is Henry VIII of England, of course. The woman on the left there is his wife, Catherine of Aragon. She had she was interesting alliance here we have between Spain and England at this stage. Of course, Henry, well, we all know about how he wanted a son, and Catherine apparently couldn't give him a son. Well, I mean, if you knew anything about DNA and stuff like this, there you'd realize that the gender of the child is actually, it comes from it's decided mainly by the man, not by the woman. So it was a problem of his rather than the problem of any of his wives. But he decides that he wants to split with her, and the Pope won't allow it. So this is a big, and there's also this Reformation is starting to build. This is the Protestant Reformation in Northern Europe is starting to build, and Henry decides to take advantage of it. He takes advantage of it in several different ways. He not only gets to divorce Catherine of Aragon, but he also gets to he also, I mean, as a king, of course, kings, especially absolutist monarchs, they always need more money. So they're always looking for, where am I going to get my next pull of capital from? And Henry VIII is able to take advantage of splitting off from Rome in the religious sense by expropriating the monasteries. In particular, well, church holdings in general, but the monasteries in particular, which were a great source of wealth. So he manages to extract all that at one blow, and at the same time, he can also now in 1542, he makes himself king of Ireland. He couldn't do that before because he had to take it to the Pope first to say whether he could be king or not. And in this case, he was now officially, he was a Protestant, so he could do what he wanted. And this is very, very signal to what is going to happen in Ireland. So all those centuries of not being able to exert true royal authority over Ireland, all that is about to change. As a point, I should add that Henry actually always considered himself to be Catholic. He was always hoping, in the back of his mind, that there would be some sort of reconciliation between the papacy and the English monarchy, and the English monarchy would be able to be accepted back into the Catholic Church. But by later on in his life, his son, the only son he produced, who is a child when he takes over power from his father, he doesn't live very long anyway. But he is already, he's gone much beyond this. He's an out-and-out Protestant. Okay, so, and of course, religion will play a very important part of what we're talking about tonight. Okay, so we can probably move on to the next picture, I would think. Yeah, so this is Durer's picture of Irish soldiery, and it's quite interesting. I think it's a bit contrived myself, but because I don't think a Galloglass, which is the man on the left there in the heavy armor, and I don't think he would have carried a bow, or he would have. He probably wouldn't have carried a big, what the Germans called a Zweihander sword, So I think it's slightly contrived, but the basic idea of it socially is quite important. So in Ireland at the time, you had Galloglasses who were predominantly Scottish mercenaries. They were the backbone of the armies of the competing Irish chieftains. If you didn't have any Galloglasses in your army, you were pretty much bound to get beaten. The monarchs, which are the two less well armored men on either side of the Galloglass, they are the indigenous Irish equivalent of the Galloglass. So once again, they are mercenary soldiers. They get quartered on the peasantry. That wouldn't have been very popular with the peasantry, but this is a sort of developing sort of feudalism within the Irish structure, which was not really feudal at all up until this point. But the Galloglasses and the Bornachta, and then you have the Kerns at the back. The Kerns are the guys with the mullet haircuts. They're very up to date, and they were generally barefoot. They were just ordinary tenants who've been raised out by the lords. So he always had a big number of kerns we could raise up from his tenantry, as well as the more professional soldiers that I've already been talking about. Okay, so we can move on to the next one. Yeah, so this is where we start to talk about the printing press, the start of the printing press, because one of the big changes that was happening in Europe at the time was the introduction of the printing press. This was a technological innovation. I'm not quite sure where it started. I think it might have started in Italy. And it spreads over Europe. The church is very worried about it because it could be spreading heretical ideas, and of course, which it does, especially in Germany, when Martin Luther and so on start to nail treatises to the front doors of churches and things. And this so there's a lot more pictorial imagery comes up, and especially of Irish people. So and this was in England. So the English, as I say, quite centralized state. The printing presses are, of course, they're controlled by wealthy people, and wealthy people have similar interests. And they start out representing the Irish is sort of reasonably normal way. I mean, they're sort of thinking, oh, these people look different to us, and they're a bit strange. But then as this develops, you can see how it becomes it changes. You know, if you look at the previous image, the Dura one, for instance, it's from around about 1520. You can see that the people are presented as whole human beings. The 1550s one on the left is sort of in between, but then you're sort of degenerating into caricatures of racialized images of what the local people are like. The wild Irish, as they will be called in many English documents from this point on. So any, as I'm saying in the last paragraph there, any sense of respect, wonder, or empathy present in the first two is completely absent in the last slide, which is from an Elizabethan propaganda broadsheet that depicts the three types of Irish people that were supposed to dwell on the island, all the way from the gentle to the wild. And we shall have a look at that in more detail in the next picture. Yeah, so this is this would have been a broadsheet. So I mean these would have been widely circulated amongst the people who could read, or, you know, who were generally the upper classes, or at least the middle classes, and they would and it was a good means of telling your side of the story. So the aforementioned broadsheet, it was produced in various forms in the last stage of the English conquest of Ireland. It's probably around about 1600. The gentlefolk of Ireland in the center, that's the man in the red coat and the woman in the goldy color coat. They have the appearance of well-to-do new English landowners. I mentioned Edmund Spenser there. Edmund Spenser, who wrote Fairy Queen. He was actually one of these plantation landowners. We will be meeting him later as well. And he was a participant in this process. So they were seen as the ideal. This is what everybody is supposed to be striving towards, to be proper English speaking and wealthy and got lots of land, and you're investing in the market now, and so on and so forth. The civil Irish, so-called civil Irish, are on the right, and they might be tenants brought over as farmer colonists, or perhaps they're burghers in the towns. They're subject to the market relations of labor rent now rampant in England. They might be some of the unfortunates who have been evicted, because this is where a lot of the early colonists would have no doubt been. There would have been actually people who would have been kicked out, and then the only thing that they could do was to sign up for one of these plantations. But other ones would have been arriving much more. They'd be much more prosperous. They would have been the people who are making money and are expanding their farms at the expense of the peasants who don't make it in this new competitive environment. On the left are the dispossessed natives, the ungrateful wild Irish primitives who exclude themselves from this wonderful new system being built over their lands and homes with brute force, but of course, only for their own good. Right, we can move on to the next picture now. Yeah, so we're going to continue with this propaganda theme because it is very important, I think, in explaining how the whole racialized image of and sectarianized image of the Irish develops. This is a woodcut by an artist known as John Derrick, and English artist. And we're going to have a look at a couple of his pictures here. This one, as you can see, it shows an outside banquet going on with an Irish chieftain in the middle of it. He's rather peculiarly got a sword on the table. I don't think any rational person would have used a sword to chop their meat up on the table, but he seems to be doing so. In the picture, he's got his wife on one side of him, and he's got one clergyman sitting beside him, and then another clergyman standing over his shoulder telling him what to do. And this becomes this sort of image of how the new Protestant Puritan English are seeing the Catholic Church is reflected in this, but it's also racialized. So this is indicating, well, you know, these barbarians, these Irish, they're all being told what to do by the Pope and so on and so forth. And a lot of these images or tropes have carried on throughout history, in fact, right up almost to the present day. And then there's an animal being butchered in the background, and there's something being boiled over a stove. It's possibly based on actual real events that used to take place at the places known as Full Fear, which we talked about in an earlier episode. These were sort of like where you would go on a hunting expedition or something, and then you would, rather than going back to the chieftain's residence to eat it, you would actually eat it in the field with improvised implements. You would throw stones into pools to heat up and you basically boil the meat in that. So this is probably supposed to indicate one of these events. So on that level, it's accurate, but on another level, it's quite racialized. I mean, you can see the two images in the corner of people defecating or doing whatever they're doing. It's not entirely clear, without any sense of decorum or what have you. There's also a guy doing a dance. Now, this is, I think this is actually a type of dance which is known in Irish. It's known as sean-nós dance. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on. The person performing it is a poet. He's reciting the ballads or the not the ballads, the sagas that relate to the chieftain's lineage, and maybe some old tales like of much wider significance, like the Ulster cycle or whatever, and that's basically what he's doing. And the harpist is plucking the harp. So, but as you can see, there's racialized imagery here. So the sword, the defecating sword used to chop up potatoes or meat or whatever on the table is ridiculous, as is the defecating people on the right. And then, of course, you've got the obvious implication of the clergy there as well. Okay, I think we can move on to the next one. So we've got another John Derrick coming up. This is another propaganda picture or woodcut, and it shows basically how the English perceived Ireland. Of course, Ireland had its own legal system, which was not based on punishment like it was by this point in England, but it was based on reciprocity. So you would or rather than retribution, it was based on you. I've forgotten the word, but you. It was based on the idea of you owe me so much things. So say you steal a cow from me, well, in that case, you owe me, you know, whatever. That was basically how it worked. Of course, there was a lot of raiding going on from one chieftain against another chieftain, or Old English lord against another Old English lord, or Old English lord against a Gaelic Irish lord, or a Gaelic Irish lord against an English Old English lord. This was also going on. The English, however, by this point, where their centralized state and their market economy, they were thinking, well, this is just lawlessness, isn't it? So this is showing how lawless the Irish are. So they're all roaming around here, armed to the teeth, and they're setting fire to people's houses, who are incidentally Irish people. They look like, they're certainly dressed like Irish people, and chieftain's there in the background, and his men are driving away herds of cattle. Well, I mean, this is quite accurate to a degree. There was a lot of this going on, but, you know, was anything the English were bringing in any better? Well, let's have a look. Okay, so we can move on to the next picture. Yeah. So the English, originally, the English have this, the English king has this relationship with Ireland. He's now declared himself King of Ireland. So he wants all the lords of Ireland, whether they're Gaelic or Old English or whatever they are, or even in the Pale, they're all supposed to acknowledge him as the king. And Henry VIII, for example, is not really interested in much beyond that. He just wants them to acknowledge his ultimate authority over them. And he has some success, but not entirely so. Some of the Gaelic Irish lords decide it's in their interest to recognize Henry. Some of the Old English lords they might be loyal to the king, they might not be, but what Henry comes up with is this plan of surrender and regrant, where he's going to get the lords who do agree with him, or who do submit to him, to surrender their lands to him, and then he will regrant it to them back again. Some of the Irish lords are not really fooled by this, and they think it's a bad idea right from the word go. But some of them do fall for it, and they carry it out. But that's as far as Henry can take it. And Edward, his son, doesn't last very long on the throne. He doesn't get to do very much in relation to Ireland. His successor, Edward's successor, is Mary. And Mary was Catholic. She's actually married to Philip of Spain, interestingly enough, because of what happens in the period coming up. But she actually starts, she's a Catholic monarch. She's the first Catholic monarch since Henry became officially a Protestant, if not in reality. She is the first Catholic monarch, yet she is associated with the first plantations in Ireland. First plantations, predominantly of Protestant, because they wanted Protestant people to move over to Ireland, because Irish people weren't particularly that interested in changing to Protestantism, because, you know, they had a different social system. It didn't really fit, and the papal system, you know, was loose enough for them to be able to work around it. But with the plantations, this all starts to change. But Mary's pioneering efforts are rather disastrous. She sets up people in what will become known as King and Queen's County in Ireland. Now the counties of Laois and Offaly, and and interestingly enough, I mean the main town in Offaly, I think, is named after Mary, and in Laois it's named after Philip of Spain, and it becomes Philipstown, I think, which is quite unusual. So this becomes Kings and Queens County in settler-colonial Ireland, and nobody questions who these monarchs actually are. One a quite rabid English Catholic, and the other one again a Catholic monarch, but not even an English one, a monarch of Spain. So that's quite interesting. So her idea of the settler-colonial experiment is it's more like to use them as a buffer to protect the Pale from attack. So you can see some experiments there. There's a light green one, which happens a bit later on under Elizabeth, and then there's the blue one, which is Mary's one, but none of them really work that well. There's also a campaign into what becomes the counties of Antrim and Down, and you can see that in orange there. So that's taken up by Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a Protestant, and she takes on the task of planting. She makes some important changes in how the plantations are going to take place. So she's much more interested in getting English settlers over directly, and she uses the market as a means of doing that. So she tells rising capitalist lords in England, she says, you know, this is a business opportunity for you to invest in Ireland and make it into a new place where you can make lots of money, and so on and so forth. So she and while she's conquering Antrim and Down, then there's a series of rebellions which kicks off in Ireland. The Irish lords, the Gaelic Irish lords at least, are starting to realize that their power is threatened by these new developments, and that they're basically being otherized in the same way as their peasants, or their tenants are as well. So then they're not very happy about it. The first one to rise up is Feichin Byrne, and that's the 1570s. His rising is put down very, very fiercely. He originally has great success. He wins astonishing victory at Glenmalure and destroys an English army there, but it doesn't last, and of course he is captured, and then he's I think he was actually starved to death in a cage over the entrance to the English garrison's fortress. And this is sort of, you start to move away from surrender and regrant by this point. It's like surrender or else. it's becoming increasingly so. And of course, the Irish lords are starting to realize this. And then there's a rebellion of Desmond. The rebellion of Desmond is 1579 to 1583. And you can see that the areas marked out in pink are the areas which rebelled and which were crushed by Elizabeth's armies, and where they started to bring in some more plantations from England. This is where Edmund Spencer and Walter Raleigh, who were two of Elizabeth's most flamboyant supporters, they got involved in this plantation as well, and they were Edmund Spencer in particular wrote about it, and quite he said, oh, we're doing wonders for Ireland, and we're cleaning up the vagabonds and the wild Irish from the land, and we're putting it to productive use. This term of productivity is coming into fashion because it's all part of the whole capitalist ethic which is developing in England. And so, but the Desmond Rebellion is crushed, as I say. This is Fitzgerald's and the Butlers. It basically arose out of a dispute between two old English lords, the Fitzgeralds of Desmond and the Butlers, and they fell out, and the consequences was the Fitzgeralds rebelled against the Crown because they thought that Crown was taking the side of the Butlers, and but the rebellion spread, and it also involved the McCarthys of Kerry, and there was quite extensive land confiscations. But of course, there were high risks involved with all these investments, as we shall see. Okay, so we can probably move on to the next picture now. Yes, so this is again by John Derrick, actually, and this one shows what was really going on, which we will talk about again in the picture after this. But at the moment, let's focus on what's going on here. So it's an English army wandering across the land. The officers at the front have got Irish heads on the end of their swords, or they're carrying heads. Now, the taking of heads was actually quite, it has a long history in Ireland. It goes way back before the English get there, but the English sort of take it to extreme level. Lord Essex, who was supposedly Elizabeth's lover, or at least tried to be, or whatever, he was in charge of the army in Ireland at the time, and his tent in the field was apparently, he had a row. You had to walk through an avenue of severed Irish heads to get to his tent, and that was where he held audience. So there was a lot of quite nasty, bordering on genocidal, if not actually genocidal, slaughter going on, and of course a lot of people who avoided the slaughter, they ran off to the woods or the mountains or whatever, and then they would, more than likely, they would have died there because there wouldn't have been enough food to feed them. We know that the population of Ireland shrank enormously in this period. We suspect we may have, out of a population of maybe 1 to 1.5 million at the time, it declined by at least 100,000 during during the period of Elizabeth's wars alone. So and the English army, the English army in Flanders, there were two English armies, well, three English armies, include the English army facing the Scots, but the English army in Flanders was only about 10 or 12,000 men maximum. The English army, and that was to fight the Spanish, because now the Spanish were enemies. They hadn't been previously, they'd been allies, but now they are enemies. And in Ireland, there's at least 30,000 English troops rampaging around the countryside as they're doing here, and ruling by terror. Now, I mean, what is quite interesting is you know how colonialists and, you know, for instance, the Nazis did the same sort of thing. You know, they were so proud of what they did that they actually, you know, we actually have some of the documentation of them committing their atrocities because they have survived because of them recording it themselves. Not the victims, but obviously they were so confident of success, so and they were confident that they were doing the right thing. So this is how they show them. They're even able to show themselves up for what they're really doing. And as you can see, you know, in the previous picture, we had Irish lords were driving off the cattle, and now you've got the English are driving off the cattle as well, you see, and probably on a much bigger scale. This will probably one of the reasons leads to the great starvation that killed off a lot of those people who had avoided having their heads put on swords. Okay, we can move on to the next picture. So, so we're now going to talk about Gráinne ní Mhaile. She, or Grace O'Malley, she's commonly known in English. She's quite an important figure. Not so much in terms. I mean, she was a relatively minor chieftain, but she was a woman. This is quite important because women very rarely rise to the top, the apex of Irish society at this time, or at least, I mean, in legal terms, they have rights. It's not that they're chattels, but they do. That it's very rare for an English for a woman to rise to the top of her tua or clan. It's a clan is not really the right word at all. Clan actually means children, but it's been sort of adopted in English as a term for these groupings which existed in Ireland before English law was established over the country. So she played very, very cannily with her internal rivals in her own dynastic line, the Finne, but she also fought enemy. You know, she had local enemies. You know, other to her were her enemies. They were Flatties and people like this. She also built a pirate fleet. Now this is quite interesting because she built it would have been relatively small pirate fleet that she had, but they raided, I think all the way around to County Cork, and all the way up to, I think, Ulster. or Donegal, and they would have been predominantly targeting English merchants at sea. So the English merchants coming laden with the goods which they'd probably stolen off the Irish, and she took them back. Of course, she didn't share it with very many people, apart from her own kith and kin, but she was at least making a go of it, you could argue. Eventually, of course, an English army marches on her castle, and she's forced into surrender and regrant, which is this term which I've been talking about. So Grace had to go to London to submit to England's own pirate queen, because good Queen Bess, as the English like to call her, she was busy plundering the Spanish Main, which she was again, as I say, these absolutist monarchs, they're always on the lookout for gold and silver, and Spanish Main was a good source of that. If you had ships that could take out Spanish galleons there, and the Spanish galleons, of course, were also plunderers, because they were plundering the native American societies of their gold and silver. So who's the victim here, and who's the exploiter? It's very difficult to know. But anyway, she when she was forced to go to London, there was a famous meeting that allegedly took place between them, which is shown in the picture there, or at least we don't really have any pictures of Grania Nual. This is an imaginary picture from, I think, the 17th century, where they sort of were trying to imagine her doing her paying homage to, or submitting to Queen Elizabeth, but not really. She didn't offer anything else. She just recognized her as her liege lord, and then she just packed her bags and went back home. And she didn't really offer anything else. She didn't grovel. She didn't ask her to attack her. She didn't offer to give any troops to the English army or anything like this. So, but unfortunately, she survived. Again, that was luck more than anything. She survived with her lands and honor intact, but her skills and success didn't pass to her successors, and soon the O'Malley lands were lost too. I should explain a little bit about what's going on in England at the time as well. We've been talking about this process of early capital accumulation through rural exploitation of the peasantry and their eviction in many cases from the land. But between Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, we know that 57,000 vagrants, as they call them, basically just people who've been kicked off their own land, were executed. And there were also many other punishments that were inflicted on anybody who was seen to be a vagrant. I'll just give you this quote here. This is from a 1572 English Act that was passed. It says, all fencers, meaning fence like this, bear wards, that's people who look after performing bears, common players of interludes and minstrels, not belonging to any baron of this realm or to any other honorable person of greater degree, where they are wandering abroad without the license of two justices at the least, are subject to be grievously whipped and burned through the gristle of their right ear with a hot iron of the compass of an inch about. So you get what's happening here is, if this is happening in England, okay, you know, it's a natural progression of that mentality, that way of thinking, to go and do it in Ireland as well. And similarly, of course, it will be also used in the context of slavery, which is another horror yet to arise, the West African slave trade. But in terms of what's happening in England, it's quite interesting to and if we look at what the three divisions of society, with the gentle Irish at the top, meaning English, planter landowners, and the wild Irish at the bottom. This similar sorts of divisions were occurring in England itself. So instead of the wild Irish, of course, it becomes the vagrants. So these vagrants, they must be got rid of some way. If you can't execute enough of them, you can't torture enough of them, then what you've got to do is you've got to send them overseas. So a lot of this is where the English get the labor power for the plantations, which they're going to start in the New World. And so they and then once again they're trying to do the same in Ireland, in a slightly different context. It's more of a racialized context, more of a sectarian thing. But anyway, that's what's going on. So we can move to the next picture, I think. Oh yes, I should just mention while we're talking about the last bit was there's William Cecil's Vagabonds Act of 1597, and Sir Francis Hastings has this idea of the workhouse about 100 or 200 years before any workhouses come into existence. He says all vagrants, meaning anybody who's found wandering about, starving or whatever, is to be sent to a house of correction after being soundly whipped. I mean, this is a sort of mentality which is rising. It is quite worrying, I think. And the Jacobean Parliament, which is the one that succeeds Elizabeth I's reign, and the one that brings in James II, or James I, James VI of Scotland, in as the King of England. They come up with this whole idea of transportation. You transport the undesirables of your own country to the plantations abroad, the colonies, basically. So this is what's going on. Now we were now at the point of the Spanish Armada. I'm sure most of you have heard about the Spanish Armada. I don't need to go into great detail, but it was supposed to either conquer England or subject, give the English a bloody nose. It didn't work out that way. The fleet, most of the fleet did actually survive the battles of the English. The problem was they were cut off, and the only way they could get back was around the coast of Scotland and Ireland, which coming up to winter is not a very good place to be, especially if you've got wooden ships with powered by sails, and a lot of them ended up smashed up on the shore of particularly Ireland, also a little bit in Scotland, but in particular in Ireland. Now there was a survivor. There weren't very many survivors. But there was this guy, and his name was Francisco de Cuellar, or Cuellar, and he is one of the few survivors of 1588 Spanish Armada, who was wrecked on the west coast of Ireland, who actually survived. Weren't very many of them. He was one of them, and he gives once he settled in, and once he did eventually make it to Flanders, to Spanish-held Flanders, and he was and when he'd recovered from his ordeal, which was what he suffered, he gave a very graphic and horrific account of what was going on in Ireland. It was not only of his own experiences, but he also describes the desolate state of the country. Now, if you can think about it, there are English armies running up and down the country from one place to another. They were either telling people to surrender, or else they were that would be the local Irish lords or Old English lords, or else they were actually engaged in scourging the country. So he sort of a little bit like his description in places. It's a bit like what's his name? The English. Well, it wasn't really English. The author of oh dear, I've forgotten the name of the bloody book now. Heart of Darkness. Joseph Conrad. So it's a bit like this, and as we know, Joseph Conrad was describing what was going on in the Congo in his day, and Francisco de Cuellar is describing what is actually going on in Ireland at the time. So he first of all runs into a bunch of Irish desperados who rob and beat, and sometimes they stick knives in them and various other things. And then the next thing he finds some English soldiers, and he thinks, oh, I'll just surrender to them and I'll be okay, because we're all gentlemen here. And then he realizes his friends are all being butchered, having their heads chopped off by the English, and he decides that's not such a good idea. He runs off and he joins Irish lord in the countryside, and he holds the lord's castle or tower house. He holds it for while the lord is actually hiding from the English army, and he actually manages to hold the castle against the English. Of course, it doesn't save the lord, the Irish lord. The Irish lord gets gubbed soon after that happened. But and everywhere he goes, he meets the same air of desolation and basically country that's been laid waste. The account is very useful because it gives insight into the grim realities of Tudor policy in Ireland. We've seen the woodcuts, we've seen the paper broadsheets, but the actual reality, what the English people write about, like people like Edmund Spencer, is completely different. Actually, Edmund Spencer did actually say that Lord Essex was taking things too far with his avenue of heads, but these sort of surviving accounts do give a better idea of what's going on for the majority of Irish people, because he's forced to live as a fugitive. As you can see, he was quite a wealthy gentleman, probably back in Spain. He apparently arrived laden down with gold. That didn't last very long. but he's soon relieved of that, and then he's and by the end of it, he's a beggar basically. But he does make it out of the country, and we are thankful for his account because it's very informative as to what was going on in Ireland at the time. Right, next picture. Yeah, so there's the 9 Years' War is 1594 to 1603, and it embroils Ireland and England in perhaps its most bitter round of fighting yet. The rebellion is led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, who's on the left, and Red Hugh O'Donnell. Now, this is a statue in Donegal Castle. It possibly does not actually, there's no images of, same as with Grace O'Malley, no images actually remain of him. So we just, it's a conjectural picture of what he might have looked like. So he's on the right. So he was Earl of Tyrconnell, which is basically in Donegal, and Hugh O'Neill was the Earl of Tyrone and Armagh, those sort of traditional Northern O'Neill territories. And it was the last attempt to stave off English conquest of the entire Ireland. Now, one can argue that these two people left it too late, because if they'd got involved in the Desmond uprising, for instance, they could have, the English army would have been stretched enough as it was, and they could have conquered the or they could have thrown the English out of Ireland completely, because O'Neill in particular, he was a very good leader. Hugh O'Donnell was a brave leader, but he wasn't very good at strategy and tactics, whereas O'Neill definitely was. He won several battles against the English, Clontibret in 1595, Yellow Ford, 1598. There's just two of them. Of course, he was like Hannibal, he was defeated in his last battle, but the Battle of Kinsale in 1601, and then after that, the whole rebellion starts to crumble. Interestingly, Spencer loses his new gotten plantations in this period, because the army from the north, because that's where it was basically an Ulster army. That's where it comes from. They've also, by the 1590s, this could have, if you want to make a good argument for Hugh O'Neill, you could say, well, he was actually secretly reforming the army so that they could fight in the English to the English standard, which is pike and shot, as it was known at the time. And he was also negotiating an alliance with Catholic Spain. But he also acted far too late, and indeed, earlier on, he submitted to Henry VIII just to get the title of Earl. Why did he need the title? Well, so he's a bit of a mixed bag. Both of these characters, O'Donnell and O'Neill, were also rivals. And in the last battle of Kinsale, O'Donnell gets rash and decides to do an attack, and O'Neill can't stop him, and both of them lose the battle. So that's basically what happens. And then 1603, they come to, they basically have to surrender. They're allowed to leave the country. It's called the Flight of the Earls. So these two earls and a lot of their aristocratic supporters leave the country en masse. They go either to Catholic Spain or to France to pursue careers there. And of course, there are descendants to this day of these people in these places, but they all leave, and they leave their tenants to the tender mercies of the English planters, who are coming in now en masse because of the opportunity which has arisen to plant colonies is starting to take shape in Ulster more than any other country, because they got rid of so many of the Irish, the indigenous Irish lords, so many of them, and this is originally one of the strongest of the Irish regions, the most impenetrable Irish region, and they get rid of them, and then they start to bring in the plantations en masse. And this starts under James I or James VI of Scotland, depending which title you want to give him. He held both at the same time. He's a Protestant, although he's the son of Mary Queen of Scots, but he was Catholic. He is a Protestant, and he's made King of England, and then it's in his reign where the free market is given full reign over the new plantations of Ulster, and this is the start of a whole series of events in Irish history related to the consequences of this particular plantation, which is still going on to this very day. Okay, we can have the next picture. So the end of the rebellion, the flight of the Earls, means that the entire as yet uncolonized area of Ulster, which is Donegal, Derry, Tyrone, Fermanagh, Cavan, and Armagh, they now fall under the sole direct control of the English crown. English Elizabeth I is also, she's no longer with us, and she leaves her handiwork to, as I was saying, James VI or James I. And even though, I mean, this is interesting. I mean, the English had virtually ruined themselves in the conquest of Ireland. It had cost them so much because they'd had to maintain these armies in the field I mean, there was huge cost to the Irish people, of course, but in financial terms, there was huge cost as well to the English crown, because the English armies had been defeated, especially by the last rebellion, the Ulster Rebellion. The 9 Years' War had inflicted several major defeats on the English, mostly in places of where, because Hugh O'Neill was very good at choosing his terrain, so he chose the terrain that would suit his type of army, which wasn't even though they'd been trained as pike and shot, they didn't fight in the solid blocks like the English, and so they used those tactics against the colonists. The plantations would be pursued in Ulster that they'd not been able to realize to a degree anywhere else, because of after the flight of the Earls, the deed holders to the lands were mostly either absent, they were either dead or they were abroad, or even if they had been around, they would have been personas non gratis. They would have, if they stuck their head up and said, "Oh, I actually own this land," that would be okay, right? Well, you're coming to the Tower of London, and where some gallows will be waiting you. So so between 1607 and 1610, this is when the big plantation starts. So this is James I. He's able to extensively plant Ulster, that's the 9 counties of Ulster, with English and Scottish settler colonialists, by now almost exclusively of the Protestant faith, whether they Anglicans or Calvinists. Calvinists mainly coming from Scotland, the Anglicans from England. And the plantations of Elizabeth are shown that she'd already accomplished, are shown in the brown and in the very light green there. That was an earlier stage of the conquest, and the rest of them are a mix of English and Scots planters. Now you can see what's now County Derry, which is pink. Now this shows the plantations, completely privatized plantations by London, firms of London merchants, companies of London merchants who banded together to establish these colonies in County Derry. So this is considered to be a true triumph for market forces, and of course these policies will be pursued elsewhere as well. They'll be pursued in North America and a few other places as well, the Caribbean. Okay, we can move on to the next one. Yeah, so this just gives you a rough idea of what a plantation colony might have looked like. This is done along in what's now Northern Ireland, and it's a typical planter. So the main landowner, I think, was called John Bowles. He was a planter landlord, and he owns the house in the middle of it, which is surrounded by a moat, and then there's the harbour where he's bringing in his supplies and so on and so forth. And then he's around the rest of the civil Irish. So he's of the gentle Irish, and then the civil Irish are the new people who have arrived from either Ireland, from England or Scotland, and they are living in the town, which is growing up around it. And then there's the cannons sitting up on the ramparts, which are overlooking the rest of it, and you can see beyond that is where the native Irish are still trying to survive, eke a living at the behest of the new landowners. And of course, although the plantation lords, I mean, even though they've been told by the English government to get rid of the Irish and altogether, they're actually quite happy to take them on as subtenants. So because it means more money for them, so in a lot of cases, even within the plantations, the Irish are able to just hang on for grim life to their lands, but under very adverse circumstances. And of course, these sort of arrangements where the planters take the good land and leave the wastes to the Catholics, Catholic Irish, that sets a precedent for the future, and for what's even happening today. Okay, we can move on to the next picture. Yeah, so this is one of the many depictions. There are many of the massacre at Portadown. Now, this happened during the 1641. In 1641, there was an uprising in Ulster against the where the Catholic Irish, who were still hanging around, as I mentioned, and even some of the old lords managed to slip back in again, or at least come out of the forest. But and they take advantage of what's happening in England with the English are now at each other's throat. The English Civil War or English Revolution, depending what you want to call it, is taking place, and in Ireland there's an uprising, especially in Ulster, to kick out the colonial society. And of course, it's depicted in many manuscripts because it's a good opportunity for propaganda. It's a good opportunity to show, the fate that can, these wild Irish are coming back, and they're massacring us in our beds, and so on and so forth. And in fact, this only happened really in two. We do know a substantial number of people were killed, but it actually only really happened in 2 of the 9 counties. It mainly happened in County Derry. We've already talked about Derry. That's the privatized exploits of the London merchants. It also happens in County Armagh, and this is and South Down to a degree. This is where these are where predominantly English settlers are settled. I think there is something to be said about this, because although the Scots are more extreme Protestants, as it were, they're also less wealthy generally, and one can imagine, because some of them would have had contact, especially from Scottish borders and the Galloway region, where a lot of them were coming from, they would have had contact with Gaelic speakers and things like this here. So it's quite possible that the lack of massacres and so on and so forth that occur in the regions where there was a substantial number of Scottish settlers is because the Irish didn't actually resent them that much. Whereas, I mean, in this case, the Portadown massacre and so on and so forth, that was probably, the Irish chiefs themselves. I mean, they were very bitter that their lands had been stolen off them, and so they wanted to get rid of these people on it. So it's probably, it doesn't seem to have been organized by the leader of the rebellion. He was known as Owen Rowan-Neil. But it does seem to have happened. A few of his henchmen got involved in these widespread massacres. But of course, I mean, the thing is, you've got images like this, which are shocking and horrible, but on the other side, you don't see very many of pictures of what Cromwell's soldiers were doing, which is pretty much the same sort of thing. Cromwell coming in a little bit later on. Or Elizabeth's troops would have been doing this sort of thing as well. So, and on a much greater scale, I would have to say. Okay, so we can move on to the next picture. Yeah, so as I mentioned him, don't mention the devil or he shall appear. We have Cromwell. Now, Cromwell had emerged out of the English Revolution. He wasn't, first of all, he crushes all radical elements in the English Revolution, including a group of English soldiers who, in the new model army, there was a group of English soldiers known as the Levellers, and they were not happy about going to Ireland. They actually petitioned Cromwell, and they said, we don't want to go to Ireland because the Irish should be left to govern themselves. And Cromwell executes their leaders, and he just does it anyway. So he is sort of, you could see him as the first. He never becomes a monarch. He's always the Lord Protector of the realm, but he pretty much runs the place like a dictatorship. So he's sort of the first properly capitalist monarch in English history. And of course, he goes over to Ireland in pursuit of royalists who've taken shelter there, and they formed the Confederation of Kilkenny, along with indigenous Irish. It becomes obvious quite early on that neither sides really trust each other, because a lot of the royalists in Ireland are in fact Old English settlers, and who recognize Charles I as King of England, and whereas the Irish people have a different agenda completely. They just want rid of the English altogether by this point. So this is on the right there. You can see this is a pictorial representation. Again, it's sort of propagandistic. It's the massacre at Drogheda. It's recently been argued, some historians made a case that Cromwell really wasn't as nasty as we've been led to believe. You know, these sort of massacres were very common in 30 Years' War in Europe, which is another war that was devastating Central Europe at the time. You know, I mean, in fact, if you go all the way back to Caesar and beyond that, there was this understanding that if you engaged in a siege, the siege was likely to be very costly to both sides, but especially the besieger, because his troops would probably die of starvation or of disease or whatever while they were besieging, and so if the city refused to surrender, then they were basically at your mercy. Now, what seems to have happened there is not quite what the picture represents. I'm not letting Cromwell off the hook by any chance, but I'm just pointing out that he's positioned on a horse overlooking the massacre. But it seems that he actually spent all the time in his tent, and he just gave the order basically for this to happen. So he didn't actually stand over it and watch it. He just said, you know, it's your right to his troops. It's your right to plunder the city, and do what you will with the captives. And of course, a lot of people were massacred, but not many of them were Irish, or at least Gaelic Irish. A lot of them were English royalists who had fled England, and also old English, as I've been talking about, old English lords and so on. And so anyway, they were massacred, and there's this debate which is going on in English historical circles. Or did he really order the massacre, or didn't he? What was his real role in it, and so on and so forth? Well, I mean, he was in charge of the army, so you know he's responsible basically. But I could understand that he didn't, you know, he was just, he didn't really think too much about it. It was like sort of reaction I would thought that he would have had. because he also did something very similar in Wexford, which is the next city he lays waste to in Ireland. He does something very similar there, and we know that at Wexford he actually did give the order directly for his soldiers to do this. But he also realizes later on that it's actually counterproductive to do this. So when he takes other cities like Clonmel, for instance, in County Cork, he gives specific orders for massacres not to take place, because obviously the propaganda purposes for his enemies is not really helping the situation. What's also interesting as well is that the Old English, or the English Anglicans who have rebelled, who are supporting King Charles, they get off quite lightly. Not the Irish. The Irish get, the Gaelic Irish, that is, they get transported. This whole thing of transportation, which I've been talking about before, this William Cecil law in late Elizabeth time, there's a mass use of transporting the Irish out of their own country, get rid of them, send them over to the Caribbean or to the Americas, and get them to work in the plantations. Of course, soon they will discover that that African slaves are cheaper to buy than Irish slaves, and so, or English slaves. English. When I say slaves, I mean indentured labor or penal labor in the case of the Irish, indentured labor in the case of the English, which is sent over to start working the colonies for the benefactors of the English capitalist order. So anyway, that's enough on Cromwell. I think we can move on to the next picture. Yeah. So while Cromwell is in control, the Cromwellian Act of Settlement in 1652 confiscates the land of anyone who's taken up arms for the king, or against Parliament, or who had taken part in the Irish Rebellion, the Ulster Rebellion of 1641, and takes the lands of all Catholic landowners this time, or at least in theory, not in practice, as we shall find out, but at least in theory, he wants to get rid of every single Catholic landowners, unless their lands are beyond the River Shannon, that meaning in the far west of Ireland, in the pale, very pale coloured regions in the west there, what's now known as Connacht and County Clare. And his famous outburst of "To hell or Connacht" is directed at any Catholic Irish who own land. The Act also, interestingly, potentially penalizes Anglican settler gentry who had taken the side of the king. They were also penalized, but however, they were able to appeal, pay a fee, and make amends, unlike the Gaelic Irish, who were personas non gratis. The map on the left shows the extent of the confiscations. By now, except for some surviving pockets in counties Antrim and Carlow, there are virtually hardly any Irish Catholic landowners, Gaelic Irish basically, east of the Shannon. And even in the west, it's not really shown in the map, but there were huge inroads into the west as well. They were scattered throughout Connacht in small groups on the worst land. The best land had been taken by the settlers. The penal laws, which some of us will have heard about, they actually begin in Cromwell's time. There are additional restrictions on the practice of the Catholic faith, on Catholic rights to serve in the English army and or navy, and to hold public office again, or to practice professions in the towns. So it's becoming like an apartheid society. This is possibly where the whole idea of apartheid begins. And bans on speaking the Irish language follow, on inheritance of property. So you can't, as a Catholic owner of land or whatever, you can't pass it on to your children. You have to sell it. And even on living in cities, there was even legislation brought out to prevent Gaelic Irish people from living in cities. So they were effectively to be disinherited out of their own country. These laws were very draconian and very brutal, but the actual putting them into practice was a lot more difficult than putting them on writing. And there were quite often local arrangements, where the planters were less acquisitive, then they might come to some local arrangements with the Irish, and they say, you can speak your language, and you can even go to mass and so forth. We'll just turn a blind eye to it. Whereas in other places, it would have been completely the opposite. They would have followed Cromwell's laws to the letter. Okay, so we can move on to the next picture. We're moving on quite heavily into history now. Yes, so in 1689, there's a succession crisis in the United Kingdom. This is between the reigning King James II, and who's on the left there, and Prince William of Orange, who's on the right. He comes from the Netherlands, because the English monarchy, it keeps on running out of successors at this period. All the way from Henry VIII onwards, it's running out of successors at every opportunity. And this is another gap that appears. Basically, there isn't really a gap because James is still about, but he's a bit of a he takes his absolutist monarchy, monarchical powers, which he's inherited from the Charleses. He takes them in he's quite keen on them, and in expanding them, and he also sides with the more old school nobility. The new school nobility are dead against that. They are the Puritans. They're the followers of the new order, which is established during the English Revolution, the capitalist order in England, and they choose William Prince of Orange to be his successor. Then there's a coup, court coup, which is actually successful, and James is deposed, and suddenly he finds out about a place called Ireland. He wasn't interested in Ireland at all before this, but suddenly he's very interested in Ireland, because it's the only place where he can raise an army local to hand, and possibly regain his kingdom. So that's where he goes to do it. He didn't make a very good impression in Ireland. We know him as Seamus on Haka, which in literal translates as James the Shit, because he was, not only was he very unpopular in England, but he also managed to make himself very unpopular in Ireland, where he was trying to raise an army to fight the new order in English, the so-called Glorious Revolution. Now, a lot of nonsense is being written about the Glorious Revolution as well. One has to point out what was actually going on in reality. There's a whole lot of waffle written about it, but in reality, the crisis had more to do with breaking the royal monopoly over the profitable West African slave trade, which had proved to be a very profitable enterprise. And the free marketeers, well, they wanted a slice of the pie as well. And William of Orange was going to offer them that, whereas James II wanted to keep the money from that flowing into his own purse. And it's also, it's quite ironic, several powers were, including Britain, well, it wasn't known as Britain then, it was literally the United Kingdom, or the two kingdoms, Scotland and England at this point. And they were, and the Netherlands and the Pope, because the Te Deum, or when William of Orange defeated James II in battle in Ireland at the Boyne, there was a Te Deum offered to celebrate his victory in Rome. So, you sort of get the idea that incredible hypocrisies were being thrown about here about who was, what people's real motives were and what their supposed motives were. And they were, it was all part of a ploy to rein in the ambitions of France's King Louis XIV, the Sun King, in this great game at the end of the 17th century. So that's what's going on. Last picture now. Yeah. So once the William and James had their traded blows, and James had come off worse, and he fled. He was never to return. Of course, his sons became the old pretender and the young pretender, or rather his sons and grandson. But that's of a different era. They become the Jacobites, but both of them have completely forgotten about Ireland. As soon as they left the country, before they arrived, James didn't even know what Ireland was, and I'm sure William didn't know anything about what it was either. He couldn't even speak English, let alone Irish. And William, both of them immediately forgot about the country, or as much as they could, they forgot about it. So, but of course, for the Irish, there was still a war going on. So the remnants of the Irish Gaelic landowners make a stand around Limerick in the west of Ireland, and which they do fairly successfully for a bit. But at the Battle of Aughrim, they lose everything. They go back into Limerick. This is famous siege of Limerick is carried out, and they perform reasonably well at that, but they are trapped in the city of Limerick, and there's not much that they can do. So after a few months of siege, they surrender under terms, and they're forced to evacuate. This is the remnants of the Irish gentry, as you want to call them, are forced to evacuate to either France or Spain, a bit like the flight of the Earls 100 years before. This event, the 1691 event, is known as the Flight of the Wild Geese in Irish history. So what happens after this is that the English are finally able to establish English laws and English language all over the country. not entirely so, because still vast areas of the country where Irish people live, and of course they go to mass and they speak Irish, and they carry on trying to do things in the same sort of way as before, but they're pretty impoverished, most of the ones that remain. The wealthier ones evacuate. If they haven't already done so, they've certainly evacuated by the early 18th century. And the whole country is in the grip of the colonists, especially the colonist elite. One has to distinguish between them, because that becomes important, of course, in the 18th century, because one of the first stupid things the English do is they decide, or not the English, actually, this is the Anglo-Irish, the new settlers, they form their own parliament. They're only Anglican Protestants are allowed to be part of the parliament, and they pass a whole lot of laws at the end of the 17th century and the early 18th century, which basically much like what Cromwell had tried to do earlier, a whole lot of ridiculous sectarian and apartheid type laws get introduced, but they also make the mistake of using them against the Calvinists, against the dissenters. So those are the people mainly of Scottish extraction who suddenly find themselves at the receiving end of the restrictive laws which are being placed on Catholics, and of course that will have consequences as well, about a century on from where we leave off. So I hope that has given you a good resume of these traumatic 200 final years of Gaelic Irish society, and the consequences, which of course we are still living with today. And also I hope you've also been interested in the context, the context of what's going on in Europe, and the context of what's going on economically, as far as England's development. England reaches a stage of capitalism far in advance of any other country in the world, and it's a fairly unique phenomenon. Okay,